So welcome everyone to Out of the Garden Shed. I'm Rachel, and today we're going to be talking about quick and dirty garden design, which actually isn't going to be that dirty. This is a great way if you're having trouble starting or you're feeling overwhelmed by all of the information out there, all of the planning you could do before you get started, to pick a spot, pick a limited amount of space, a limited amount of things you're going to grow, and then just use 3 simple steps, perspectives to get it designed and going. So the reason that we do design in the garden is because there are 3 dimensions of space, right? And then there's time in the garden. And we're thinking about all of those 4 dimensions because they will affect the way that our plants interact with space and each other and grow over time. So there's 2 ways that we're thinking about time. We're thinking about time cyclically, the daylight every day, and then we're also thinking about like seasonal, like ongoing time as the plants get bigger. So we're going to talk about 3 different steps, and then we're going to do some drawing on paper to show how you can just grab some scrap paper, pick a spot that you're going to try to grow some food, whether it be on a balcony or a windowsill or a full garden plot. Or anything in between, anything bigger, smaller. And you can just get to work or play, however you want to do it. So the 3 things that we're going to focus on are going to be sunlight, spacing, and access. Sunlight, spacing, and access. So these are the things that are going to help us create a garden that will grow us food or whatever other plants that you're trying to grow fairly successfully, hopefully, the first go. A lot of the time when I've started a garden, I have planted things too close together. I've planted them, a short plant next to a tall plant when the sun was coming from this direction and it shaded it. Or I've forgotten that it's incredibly painful for me to bend over at the angle that I have set up my container at in terms of access. So these 3 things really lower the barrier to just getting going, and it's really fun to sketch and draw. And you can sketch and draw them even for just like a container pot, you know, that's round. And I'll show you some examples outside later after we do our drawing of mini gardens in container pots where there's still multiple species or multiple different kinds of plants, and the way that space, sunlight, and access have been thought about in those. So before you get to your drawing, here's some things you might want to do. Get some paper and a pencil, or whatever else you use to draw or map things out. Decide what plants you're excited about growing. I would recommend that you pick 3 or less for this first go, especially if you're working with a small space. And just take a moment to Google those plants with the phrase companion planting, and see if you find anything that says that those 3 plants that you're excited to grow together don't like to be next to each other. There are certain plants that won't grow super well next to each other. Other plants love to grow next to each other, and that's a whole field of garden and farm planning that we're going to get into in later videos or other videos. But when you're starting a garden, it's really helpful to not get discouraged. You don't need to do a ton of research, but just do a quick check to make sure that you can plant that onion next to that other plant, because some plants don't like to have onions under them and other ones love it. If you can't figure it out, don't worry. Trial and error is the best part of gardening, in my opinion. You get to learn by being in interaction with the plants themselves. Okay, so now go ahead and get a setup where you're comfortable, or as comfortable as possible, and you've got some paper and your drawing tools, and then take a moment to go physically be in the space where you're going to put your garden, even if it's a mini garden, just to feel the space itself in 3 dimensions with your body. And while you're there, take a look or a feel for the cardinal directions. See if you can figure out which direction is north, which direction is east, which is south, which is west. And then depending on what hemisphere you're in, and I'm in the northern hemisphere, the sun's always going to be slightly angled in the other half of the sky unless you're on the equator. So I'm in the northern hemisphere, that means the sun is always slightly in the southern half of the sky. That changes throughout the year how far angled into the southern half of the sky it is, but it's always in the southern half of the sky. So in the northern hemisphere, when we're gardening, we talk about southern exposure, meaning do you have a spot that's facing south? Because if so, it's going to get a good amount of sun. Don't worry if you don't. Just figure out which are the 4 cardinal directions, and then figure out some landmarks in your space that match up to those directions. So for instance, if you're on a balcony, which direction does the railing face? And it might face like northeast, and that's fine. But just make note of that so that when you're doing your drawing or your sketch, you can map those directions, because that's how we're gonna map the sunlight. Then take a look at your actual space. So if it is a container, take a look at the container, maybe measure it. You can measure with anything. You can measure hand spans, right? You can memorize the width of your own hand after using a tape measure. So like I know that mine is around 8 inches, thumb to pinky. So I use that for garden spacing a lot. But measure your area, the area that you're working with, and take note of that. And if you don't know how to measure area of a circle, don't stress too much about getting it exactly right. You can estimate it as a square and then just take a little bit off of the edges. And then get a sense of your body in the space. Is the container that you've picked sitting on the ground, what does it feel like to bend down to it, to work in it, if it's something that you need to bend down to? Is it something that you have to reach really far to get into? Is it really wide? Just get a little bit of a sense of your body interaction with the space just as it is before you start trying to design for optimal access. And once you've done those things, we'll rejoin and we'll work on our sketches. Okay, so as you can see, here we've got our paper, and I'm gonna be using a marker because I want you to be able to see what I'm doing, but I would recommend using a pencil. And remember, this is a sketch. It doesn't need to look pretty. It doesn't even need to be perfectly accurate. It's to help get an idea of things in relationship to other things in space. And if you have a different way of doing that besides sketching, right? Like if you need to place objects, physical objects, to get a sense of that, feel free to do that. I'm gonna be giving the example of sketching because that is how it works for me. So the first thing I'm gonna do is put a date on this, because if you do this more than once, it's going to be important to, wherever you keep your garden designs, be able to figure out which one you're actually going from right now. I have made that mistake before, so I'm just gonna put the date up here. Date. Ooh, that's very little. That says date. So I've got my date up in the corner, and I'll make everything else bigger. And then the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna sketch my garden bed container, whatever it is. So I know mine is about like this. And I'm just estimating. I went out, I looked at it, I felt it, I measured it. And if it helps you to use a ruler, you can, but I really just recommend sketching. So I know this direction is about 1.5 feet, 1.5 feet. That's a little sign that means feet. And I know this direction is about 3.5. Right? So just messy sketch. When I looked at my cardinal directions, when I figured out my cardinal directions, I know that this direction is north. So you can either do an arrow with just north, or you can mark all of your directions on the page. If you're using a square page, north, east, south, and west. The reason I'm gonna do that is because you remember I'm in the northern hemisphere, and so the sun is gonna arc through the sky from an angle in the southern sky. So that's sort of an estimated path of the sun shining towards my garden. So what that means is if I plant something tall right here and something shorter behind it, the sun is gonna create a shadow from the tall thing, and the short thing behind it won't get as much light. That might be fine if it's a shade tolerant plant. I am planting things here that need sun. So I picked my 3 crops. They're going to be kale, lettuce, and strawberries. So 3 different heights. Kale tends to be tall. There's my example of my kale. Lettuce tends to be a medium height. And then the strawberries are going to be sort of at ground level. The other thing is that this side is the side I have access to. This is a planter box that hangs off of a porch, and the other sides are very hard to access. So I know that I'm going to have to reach in this direction across here to be able to get to my plants. So I want access, easy access in that direction as well. So when I think about the heights of my plants here, and I think about the sun being over here, and also that I have to reach this way, so anything out here on the far edge is going to be harder for me to get to, especially if it is short and low to the ground, I'm going to be thinking that I want to put the tallest things furthest from the sun and also farthest from my point of access, because then my angle at reaching for them is going to be better. I don't have to lean over to get to them. They will grow up and I'll have a better angle at them. I'm also thinking that my lettuce and my strawberries need to not shade each other out. And I know that in this bed, this end of the bed's a little bit broken and the soil's sort of moving out. So it'd be great to have crops down here that were low to the ground so that they didn't pull over and fall over that broken edge. So I'm going to choose to put my strawberries, my little strawberry patch, this will be my sign for strawberries, down at this end. And I'm going to put my kale along the back here. And then I'm going to put my lettuce along the front. So that means that the sunlight is coming mostly this way. It'll arc throughout the day. So the morning sun won't get to the lettuce, but the midday sun and the afternoon sun will. Lettuce can take a little bit of shade, so I'm fine with that. The strawberries are going to get the full range of the sun, and then the kale is going to get a pretty full range as well, because the lettuce won't shade it out from this direction. So we've thought about sunlight, and we thought about access in terms of where we put each crop. Now let's think about spacing, that third thing, right? Sunlight, spacing, and access. I've drawn these plants here just as examples, but when you think about the overall distance, the overall length or area of your bed, a really common thing that a lot of us have done when planting a garden is to get really excited about our plants and put them right next to each other. They're baby plants usually, or seeds, and they don't have enough room then to grow and get big. So more plants does not equal more food. Proper spacing equals plants that will grow to full size. That means that you can either look up the spacing if you're going from a seed packet that has it written on there, or you can look at or imagine or feel a full-size version of that crop. So if you have some lettuce, you could hold a lettuce head, look down at it from the top. This whole thing is bird's eye view, right? I'm looking down at my garden bed from the top. And look at so if I was looking at my lettuce from the top, right? Here's my lettuce. How much space is here, right? Half of that width. And then I need a little space between, and then I can have another lettuce that has that same spacing. So let's say that the lettuce has, 3 inches here from its center to its edge, and 3 inches here from its center to its edge, and then maybe an inch between. That's a 7-inch spacing on our lettuce plants. So even if the plants look like they are alone in a sea of soil, right? If there's just so much, there's a little lettuce plant in the middle here, and then so much space in between, you're giving it room to grow up. Remember that the plant has roots under the soil. So when I have my lettuce plant here, down here, it's also got roots under the soil that are spreading out, often, depending on the plant, the same width or wider than the plant above ground. So we need to give those roots space to spread out. And also plants can tell when they're really close to another plant above ground, and they won't grow in that direction because they know that eventually they're going to be competing for sunlight. So we need to give them the proper amount of spacing. If you're not sure try a couple different ones and see. You can look up on the internet, you can look at an actual or feel an actual vegetable, or you can ask a friend, you can ask us on our Instagram, or you can just try some things out. But make sure you're really giving them enough space between them so that all your hard work on the rest of the design doesn't go unutilized. So we're gonna take a look at what this all looks like in 3 dimensions out in the garden and look at a couple different gardens and talk about access in terms of height of the garden, where it's placed in that particular dimension of space. We'll see you out there. Okay, so here we are out on the porch, and we're gonna take a look at a couple different urban garden spots here that I've got going and how they relate to what we just sketched. So let's start with the one that I actually was sketching, which is this built-in bed on the side of the porch. So this is the built-in, and as you can see, it's sort of broken off at the end. I was looking down at it from above, and I may have underestimated the length of it. You can see I've got a couple strawberry plants in here and the lettuce plants. These lettuce plants are spreading out into the spacing in between them and getting bigger as we go. So here's that garden bed, and this direction is south, right? So that means the light is coming in from the narrow end of the bed. We'll get eastern sunlight in this direction. And then in this direction we've got the house, which means that the western sunlight will get cut off at some point. I've got my lettuce in here, and then if you remember, I'm going to put my kale back here. That's because that's both going to allow the sunlight to come in this way. The kale won't, it'll block the morning sunlight on the lettuce, but it won't block any sunlight on the strawberries down there or on the lettuce midday. And also because reaching across here hurts my back, but reaching up for a tall kale plant right here, much easier on my back. And down here we're going to put the strawberries. And they're going to help hold the soil in the bed as well. Over here is another example. This is a blueberry plant in a container, but there's actually 3, 4 other plants in there. We've got creeping thyme, we've got a dandelion, we've got a strawberry, and we've got this plantain, which is a medicinal herb that also grows as a weed around here. So that's a small-ish container. I'd say that's maybe 18, 20 inches across. And you'll notice that in terms of access, I've put it up on this bench because bending down to weed that, if it were on the ground, would be really hard for my body. But having it lower might make it more accessible in your situation, if you're gardening with kids, if you're working from a chair or working kneeling, whatever works well for you. So we can really use container gardening in particular to adjust access, right? Here are the plants on the bench, and then down here, these plants are going to grow taller, the ones in the tomato cages. We've got a bean and a tomato, which means that I'll be able to access them even though they're on the lower side and that lower level. And then these along the porch are at waist height, which is great for us, but we can use chairs or benches or cinder blocks or bricks to change the height of our gardens. And you'll notice in this one, in the container, I've got the blueberry and the tall plantain on the north side, and then the low growing thing, the thyme and the strawberry and this little dandelion on the southern side of the container. I also turn these containers sometimes. That's another thing you can do if you want to get sunlight to multiple sides of them. So that's another trick. Thanks for joining today for this quick and dirty garden design lesson here at Out of the Garden Shed. And I hope that you will share your sketches with us if you want to on social media or via email, and with those around you so that you can share this quick and dirty way to get your garden started. Remember, think about sunlight, spacing, and access. Try 3 crops, and don't be afraid to make mistakes, because they're not really mistakes, they're just mistakes. They're trial and error. That's a great way to learn in the garden. It's part of the pleasure of it. So once again, I'm Rachel. This is Out of the Garden Shed. I'll see you next time.